Hello and welcome to everyone today. We're really excited for our very last event here at the Lytton Center for Spring 2023. My name is Dr. Kyle Libby. I'm a professor of history here at Ohlone College and one of the co-directors of the Lytton Center for History and the Public Good, along with my colleagues, Dr. Heather McCarty and Dr. Catherine Michael, who are joining me here today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Lytton Center as we're getting started and do a little bit of housekeeping before we introduce our panel today. We're very excited to close out our programming this semester with this excellent panel and to really hear some really thought-provoking ideas and hopefully to hear from some of you and some of your great questions as well. But to start off, I want to share with you the mission of the Lytton Center. And I'm going to read that for you right now. The Lytton Center considers ways that the study of the past can help shape the present and the future. Our mission is to inspire the Ohlone community to work for the public good through programming focused on access, equity, inclusion, justice, and service. The Lytton Center explores challenges facing our community and the world, past, present, and future, and fosters big ideas that will inspire and transform Ohlone and the larger community for the better. Through training, programming, and capacity building, the Lytton Center empowers students to advocate for a just and equitable world. So I'm very excited to get us going and get us started. We want to encourage folks today to use the Q&A feature as we're going to, if you have questions as we're going to have a question and answer after our panelists are done presenting some of their amazing research. And you'll have a chance, of course, to ask questions by using the Q&A feature. It's at the very bottom of your screen here in the Zoom webinar. And we want folks to definitely participate. If you need interpreting services, you'll see that we have an interpreter present now. If you need interpreting services, please let us know by leaving us a note in the Q&A feature now. Our interpreter will leave otherwise about 15 minutes into the program. So please let us know now if you are going to need interpreting services for the duration of the talk. I'm going to be handing things over now to my co-director and colleague, Dr. Heather McCarty, who's going to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks for getting us started. A lovely welcome and introduction. It is my pleasure to introduce our first panelist today. Dr. Mia Bird is an assistant professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy. Her research focuses on criminal justice reform and the intersections of criminal justice, health, and social safety net policies. Prior to joining the Berkeley faculty, she spent 7 years at the Public Policy Institute of California as a research fellow. At PPIC, she founded and directed the creation of a criminal justice data system that standardized and integrated individual level data from 12 county justice systems, representing 60% of the state population, and with data from state level correctional justice systems. These data allowed for the monitoring and evaluation of effects of a wave of criminal justice reforms in California. Professor Bird has been published in numerous academic journals and consults widely with research centers and organizations working on criminal justice issues in California. So welcome. I'm very excited to have you share some of your research with us today, and I will hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. I'm so happy to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of a statewide perspective on reform, and then we're going to kind of move through from the state level to the agency level to the programmatic level with the other two speakers, Meredith and Amy, today. So I'm going to go ahead and share some slides. All right. So today I'm going to talk with you a little bit about kind of the broad context for criminal justice reform in California, really thinking about what's been going on over the past decade or so to really make changes in how the criminal legal system functions and the level of incarceration in the state. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the research that's been done on reforms that have taken place. And then I'll move into discussing some of the reforms that have been more recent and that I'm engaged with studies on right now. So just to give you a picture, there's a lot that's been happening. Just to give you a picture of kind of a summary of the history of reform in California, if we pull back to the 70s, we had a real shift from more indeterminate sentencing to determinate sentencing, which meant for most people who received a conviction for a felony sentence, they were receiving a fixed time for their sentence. Not everyone, but for most people. And in that era following determinate sentencing, we had a real expansion, particularly around enhancements. So many of you may have heard of 3 strikes, or other forms of enhanced sentencing. And as a result, we saw sentences get longer and longer, and really a buildup in the criminal legal system and increasing rates of incarceration, and leading really to a peak incarceration level in 2006, 2007, that was well over capacity for the state prison system, despite many expansions in that system. And around 2010, we started to see a shift, and this was due to a number of factors. We had a state budget crisis, which made it very difficult to continue to build more prisons and to sort of build enough space to house the people that were currently incarcerated. And we also had a response from the justice system that we were simply incarcerating too many people in California for the capacity that we had, and that something had to change. And that really precipitated realignment, public safety realignment, which shifted a lot of individuals who were sentenced for felony offenses from the prison system to the jail system. But it also really shifted the incentives that criminal legal systems faced, because it required counties to decide for many individuals who had lower level felony convictions whether they wanted to really incarcerate those people for a long time in jail. And so it really shifted actually the number of people that we were incarcerating as a result of that change in incentives. And in my mind, it kicked off a wave of reforms. And you'll see everything in green following realignment as policy changes that I consider to be reforms that put downward pressure, particularly on the prison population. And so after realignment, we have Prop 36, which altered the 3 strikes enhancement. We have Prop 47, which changed the classification for certain offenses from felonies to misdemeanors, particularly drug possession offenses and lower level property offenses. And then we had Prop 57, which made folks eligible for early parole, and a number of reforms to those enhancements that built up during the blue period. We're starting to roll them back during the green period. And as a result of these changes, we really saw a shift in the prison population. And there were 2 policy reforms in particular, where you can see that public safety realignment reform. You can see that drop off in the number of people who are incarcerated in prison. And then following Prop 47, not as steep of a decline, but you can see a decline there as well. And so we have this wave of reforms that's leading to finally some downward trajectory in the prison population. And then the pandemic begins, and we see this huge drop off. And not only the pandemic, but a number of those policy reforms that I just showed you were unfolding during this period. And so we have the combined effect of the unfolding of those reforms on the prison population, as well as changes because of the pandemic. And so now we're seeing, how the population is going to come back or not, stabilize during this period. So a big question is often, in addition to how the reforms will in fact affect the prison population, how will they affect public safety? And when we're thinking of public safety, we often measure that in 2 ways. Sometimes we look at recidivism outcomes for individuals who were affected by the reform. So whether they're rearrested or they're reconvicted after being released. And then more broadly, we sometimes look at crime rates. And when we think about those 2 changes that you just saw that really affected the prison population, we see kind of mixed results around recidivism. We see sometimes some increases in rearrests, but generally a reduction in reconvictions. And that's true of both public safety realignment and for multiple populations that were affected by public safety realignment. There's some research showing that. And then for Prop 47, we saw pretty much universal declines in rearrests and reconvictions for individuals that were affected by that reform. So that's pretty good news when we're looking at those specific individuals who are affected. We're seeing that they're not having worse outcomes and in fact, often having better outcomes after the reform. That kind of research helps to solidify reforms like this. It helps to alleviate some fears around public safety implications. And we also look at crime rates, and that there's some research looking at those reforms and really trying to understand California made these changes, other states didn't. If we compare California's crime rates over that period of time to other states, what do we see? And generally speaking, we see fairly similar crime rates. There's a little bit of evidence that public safety realignment may have affected property crime rates a bit, but generally speaking, crime rates were at historic lows following these reforms. And there's not much evidence to show that these reforms changed crime rates in California. So what I'm delving into now is really trying to understand what effects some of the later reforms have. And there's two I'm going to talk to you about today. The first is Proposition 57. I mentioned it a few minutes ago. And the second is a wave of enhancement reform. So really trying to impact the added years that are added onto a sentence for different reasons. So Prop 57 was passed by voters in 2016, and it was implemented by CDCR in 2018. So we have a fairly recent reform. So if people who were affected by Prop 57 are probably being released from prison in the last few years. And there may be many more people that are still currently incarcerated that will be impacted by Prop 57. And what the proposition did is it established an early parole release process for people who were incarcerated. It was limited to nonviolent offenses, but it essentially said for those individuals who were eligible, once you had served your primary sentence, so for your primary offense, you could be considered for early parole release. This didn't mean you would be released, but it meant you could be considered. And so that resulted in an increase in releases from prison, we think. This research is really going to delve into that and say, how much of the change in the prison population that we've seen in recent years is attributable to Prop 57? How much of an effect did it have on the prison population? And among those who are eligible for consideration for early release, who is actually released? And are we seeing racial disparities in incarceration rates change because of Prop 57? And then finally, what about those public safety outcomes? And principally looking at recidivism for those who were released under Prop 57 and comparing those rates of recidivism to similar individuals who were released prior. So I'll tell you a little bit about the data and methodology. I'm not going to show you findings for these studies because they are underway right now. But in terms of data, data is always a challenge in this space. The criminal justice system is so siloed in California. And in order to actually study the effects of policy changes, we have to find a way to bring together data that are held within those silos and to be able to link that data together. And so for this project, that's just what we're doing. We're taking individual level data from CDCR, and that captures individuals who are in prison, when they came in, when they were admitted to prison, what the characteristics of the individuals are, of their stay in prison, and then when they're released. And then data from the Department of Justice on the criminal history of those individuals, which will include, prior arrests and convictions, but also will allow us to construct recidivism outcomes once they are released. And the methodology is relatively straightforward with policy change. We have the advantage of knowing that people who were moving through that prison system prior to Prop 57 didn't have the benefit of being affected by that change, and that people who are moving through following Prop 57 are in fact have the opportunity to be treated by that policy change. And so we're able to compare outcomes for those groups of individuals. So we take a few steps to try to make sure that they have similar characteristics. We use a matching strategy. And then we're able to compare their rearrest and reconviction outcomes and see if there's much of a difference. And then we add one additional layer, is just adjusting for change over time, in recidivism that might be caused by lots of factors. You can imagine the pandemic, for example. So we'll use a comparison cohort of individuals who were ineligible under Prop 57. And so we'll do a difference in differences analysis to come up with the estimate for how Prop 57 affected public safety. And the hope in doing this kind of evaluative research is really to help the state understand the effects of Prop 57, both in terms of solidifying the reform, but also thinking about how the reform might be changed over time. So we're thinking about, did it reduce prison incarceration? Did it reduce racial disparities? Should we be releasing more people? Should we be expanding eligibility to more people? And then taking a national perspective, should other states be considering similar reforms to address long sentences? So once we have findings, we hope that we'll be able to address some of these policy questions. And then a second set of reforms that we're interested in is this wave of enhancement reforms. And we've seen a number of changes by the legislature over the last few years to try to reduce all of those added years that are brought on to sentences through enhancements. And I'm just showing you an example of 3 that I think are interesting that we'll be looking at in terms of what were the effects of these enhancements on the prison population and on public safety. And so those 3 enhancements are SB 180, which the Senate constructed to limit enhancements for drug trafficking offenses, SB 1393, which allowed for judicial discretion in the use of the prior serious or violent enhancement. And that was a big one. It can be a 5-year enhancement. So that was a big one. And then SB 136, which limited the enhancement for prior felony terms. So that 1-year enhancement. And so all of these underwent reforms in recent years. And now we can bring a lens to the outcomes from these reforms and really ask what the effects were. So we're thinking about how much of that drop off in the prison population can be linked to these enhancement reforms, who's been affected by them, have we seen reductions in racial disparities, and importantly, how have these reforms affected recidivism outcomes? And so we'll be using a similar set of data and taking a similar set and using a similar methodology in order to conduct this study. So we'll be looking at individuals who were released from prison prior to the enhancement reforms, who were not affected by the reform. And then we'll be looking at similar individuals who either retroactively had the enhancement removed, or individuals who could have received the enhancement but didn't following the reforms. And similarly, we'll be comparing their rearrest and re-conviction outcomes and adjusting for changes over time in recidivism. And what we're hoping to do is to inform the legislature, to inform the governor's office, to inform the state about whether these enhancement reforms are working, whether they're reducing the prison population while maintaining public safety. And hopefully that will inform their decisions about future enhancements and how to move forward with legislation. So thank you very much. Here is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, and I look forward to our conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mia, for that great presentation. I'm looking forward to having a conversation about that once we hear from the rest of our panelists. Super interesting research. And I love how you're pulling the different data sets together. All right. Our next presenter today is Amy Lerman. And Amy Lerman is a professor and the director of the Possibility Lab at UC Berkeley. And she is also a political scientist who studies issues of race, public opinion, and political behavior, especially as they relate to punishment and social inequality in America. She is the author of 3 books, 2 of which focus on the American criminal justice system. Their titles are The Modern Prison Paradox, and her other book is Arresting Citizenship. And her scholarship can be found in a variety of journals as well. In addition to her academic work, Professor Lerman served as a speechwriter and communications consultant for national nonprofits and members of the United States Congress, a community organizer in Latin America and Southeast Asia, and an adjunct faculty member of the Prison University Project at San Quentin State Prison. She consults widely on issues related to prison reform, violence reduction, access to higher education, and law enforcement mental health. Welcome so much, Amy. We're really excited to hear about your research. Thanks for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Laying out the history of criminal justice reform in California. Right where
You know what, Amy, your connection seems not to be, oh, great. There we go. Maybe this will solve that.
is it back?
You are back and your slides are up.
Oh, fantastic. I will talk and feel free to interrupt me if I cut out again. So I'm the director of a research laboratory at UC Berkeley called the Possibility Lab. And what we do at the Possibility Lab is partner with government agencies and community organizations in order to try out new ideas. And much of the work that we do is in criminal justice and related fields. And in part, that's because it's a really extraordinary moment in criminal justice. As you saw in Mia's slides, we saw a massive buildup of mass incarceration starting really in the 1960s. And it's only recently that we've seen these phenomenal reforms. And so one of the things that we've been doing at the Possibility Lab is working with government agencies to test new ideas around decarceration, around community supervision, around reforms to public safety infrastructure and policing. And we do this in a variety of different ways. And one of the projects I'm going to talk about today is a partnership with Alameda County Probation Department. So we partnered with Alameda County Probation to test a new model of reentry that they call Pathways Home. And the idea of Pathways Home was really to think differently about how community supervision is conceived and implemented. And so our job was to conduct a formal evaluation of the program. And so to give you a sense of the goals of Pathways Home, it had sort of three big pillars. One was self-direction, so really trying to sort of foster intrinsic motivation. The typical community supervision is focused on surveillance, control, really directing the individual who is on surveillance. And the idea here was to really empower people who are coming out of prison, to give them the tools and the resources and the skills so that they could chart their own path and really help develop skills so that they could take ownership of their own supervision plan and then ultimately their own success, both during and following supervision. The other was this idea of individualized support. So staff in the probation department worked really closely with their clients to outline a set of really tailored resources, making sure that it wasn't one size fits all, but that people really got what they needed and that they got referrals to targeted interventions that were really the sets of resources and skills that they needed most. And then finally, this idea of positive reinforcement. We typically think of community supervision as being about negative reinforcement. So reincarceration or punishment of some kind for people who aren't able to maintain the conditions of their community supervision. The idea here was to find ways to increase personal investment and really do positive reinforcement, to work directly with clients to make sure that they were succeeding and that everybody was invested in their success. So the first piece of the Pathways Home project that we took a look at was this pre-release planning and collaborative probation model, which is really at the heart of Pathways Home. So the PRVC, the pre-release video conference, was an innovation that was really a fairly small tweak to the typical process of somebody coming out of prison. But what they did was they connected directly with people who were coming out of prison before they actually left the facility. And the idea there was to get ahead of pre-release planning, to make sure that even before somebody came out, they had a relationship with their supervisor on community supervision, and that the probation officer was able to check in with the client and make sure that they had the most immediate resources that they really needed. And the idea was that they did this pre-release planning and that this sort of very vulnerable period, the couple of days following release when people are sort of the most in need of intensive resources, that they were connected to those resources before leaving the facility. And then in addition, the idea was just to introduce this more collaborative model of probation, to help clients feel a sense of agency, of ownership about their case plan, connect to services that could help them meet their critical needs, and really sort of kick off this collaborative model that would proceed through the entirety of the community supervision period. So the research question that we were asking is really, our clients who receive this pre-release case planning meeting and experience this much more collaborative form of community supervision, first and foremost, relative to similar clients released during the same period, were they more likely to report to their first meeting within the required 48 hours of release? And then did they subsequently do better overall in their community supervision? And our hypothesis was that individuals assigned to Pathways Home would be more likely to make it to their first probation meeting, both because they had been introduced to their probation officer, but also because they had been connected to services that made it easier for them to transition, and that they would subsequently also be less likely to have their probation term revoked over the entirety of their community supervision, in part, again, due to the fact that they would be sort of experiencing this more supportive, collaborative model. We looked at all PRCS individuals released to Alameda County between January 2019 and December 2020. And this was a randomized control trial. So we randomly assigned people to these pre-release case planning meetings and this collaborative probation model in Pathways Home. So we had a really nice setup where we were able to directly compare the people who were assigned to Pathways Home to the people who were in the control group and continued to experience the more traditional form of community supervision. And then we looked at a variety of outcomes, including were they more likely to report and were they less likely to have their probation term revoked. There was some adjustment to the total sample of participants. So we received data on about 558 participants who were coming out of prison during this time period. And then about 76 of them were randomly assigned to the pre-release video conference and the collaborative model. We then adjusted a little bit. Because we had so few women, we looked at men only. We looked at eligibility based on risk score, which was a adjustment that was a requirement for participation in Pathways Home. And then we did have to exclude a couple of people who were sent to quarantine. This was during COVID. And so individuals who were released to a hotel instead of released directly back to the community, we weren't able to look at because for obvious reasons, they had a different reporting process. So in total, we had 261 individuals in our in the experiment and about 66 who were assigned to the PRVC and Pathways Home. And the result was that all else equal, we did see the effects we expected. Clients assigned to the PRVC were almost 17 percentage points more likely to report within their 48 hours compared to those in the control group. And across the entire time period, we did see that participants who reported on time were less likely to have their probation revoked. So there was a sort of persistent effect of the collaborative case planning model. The PRVC led to an increased likelihood of two-day reporting, and then two-day reporting lead to an increased likelihood of successful probation overall over the whole time period. And so we conclude that, even this fairly small tweak, this pre-release video conference, connecting with someone successful complete probation after the full 1-year term. Mechanism.
You know what, Amy, you're cutting out again. So sorry, you're cutting out again.
I'll keep talking.
Oh, there, it's better now. Yep, you're good.
Referrals over the larger. Importantly, they seem to receive referrals to services earlier in their supervision. And we believe that all of those things are part and parcel of the collaborative model that was at the heart of Pathways Home. The idea was to be able to connect people to the services that they need, to connect them as early as possible. And we did see those differences between the Pathways Home group and those who were experiencing the more traditional community supervision. So we are continuing to work with Pathways Home. There are other components to the reforms that they are currently implementing. And so we're excited to be working with them to look at those additional reforms. And we're thinking actively about areas for future research. Again, as Mia said, one of the really interesting things about this period is that we are seeing these reforms, not just at the state level, but also within agencies all across California. And so it's a really remarkable moment to be thinking about what works. And to the extent that we are able to find both small and large reforms at the agency level that make a difference to people's success outside prison, we're really hoping to be able to share that learning with agencies so that they can all sort of learn what works and adopt those reforms, particularly something like PRVC, which is a pretty low touch, small change that seems to make a really consequential difference. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am also looking forward to conversation. It was really interesting to learn about what a simple, high touch, but presumably not super expensive strategy could actually have such, a high return. So that's great. I look forward to diving into that in a little bit. But first, let's have our last panelist of the day get a chance to share their research. Dr. Meredith Sadin is an assistant professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy. She's a trained political scientist, and her work focuses on political access, community engagement, and inequality, and butts both broadly and within the criminal legal system. Dr. Sadin has extensive experience collaborating with practitioners, policymakers, and government agencies on projects designed to evaluate, implement, scale, and improve public policies and programs, as well as access to the whole democratic process. Dr. Sadin has published in numerous academic journals and been cited in news publications such as the New York Times and the Washington Post. She consults widely on issues related to criminal justice, re-entry, political mobilization, and voter turnout. Welcome, Dr. Sadin. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and I am just really excited about the way that the panel kind of came together as we started statewide and then kind of got to zoom in on a particular agency. And now we are going to focus on kind of system impacted population and individuals from kind of an experiential perspective. So I'm going to share my slides. All right. Okay, thank you for your patience. So today I'm going to talk about a specific project conducted a year or so ago, actually with co-panelist Dr. Amy Lerman. And I really want to focus in on the process. On the method, we're going to talk about some results as well. But the method itself, I think, is really interesting and helpful, and hopefully one we get to talk about further in the Q&A. And that is community-based participatory action, or community, sometimes called PAR, community-based participatory research. In this case, this was a specific project conducted in collaboration with Mount Tamalpais College, which is one of the kind of oldest, it is the oldest, largest degree granting prison college in the country. And it was actually recently granted accreditation. So it's the first independent liberal arts institution dedicated solely to incarcerated students. CBPR is an approach, and it's not a specific method, but it's an approach that really places community stakeholders at the center of the research process, aiming to really foster empowerment, promoting social change, strengthening community capacity, among other aims. And so this is kind of taking a step back from potentially more traditional top-down research approaches, and really utilizing a grassroots kind of collaborative approach to the collection, analysis, and dissemination of data. And so, there are various approaches. This is the approach that we took, which was really kind of to form a partnership and task force, assess community dynamics, identifying priority concerns and research questions, designing and conducting research, disseminating and translating findings, and then evaluating and sustaining a partnership. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how the Possibility Lab did that over the last few years with Mount Tamalpais College staff, faculty, and students, as well as numerous stakeholders, right, including people who are staffed at CDCR, as well as their research agency, research department. So first, we were really focused on forming a partnership. So Mount Tam College approached researchers at Berkeley about just partnering on a project, examining the effects of higher education in prison. There was a series of meetings, which were inclusive, included instructors, program administrators, researchers, formerly incarcerated students, and the college also reached out to officers, correctional officers, to the department, CDCR, as well as currently incarcerated students. And really that initial task force was building a partnership. It was building rapport. Researchers, the research team was just openly expressing their limitations with respect to their knowledge of conducting research inside prison, as well as on an area that really had very limited large sample research to date. And the MTC Collaborative really educated Berkeley on potential challenges, right, to conducting research, large scale survey research in this prison environment. Phase 2, we were assessing community dynamics, as I said. MTC Collaborative informed the Berkeley team about the program, how it worked, contextual factors. We had a history either volunteering with the program or knowing about the program, but really we immersed ourselves in learning about MTC. While the Berkeley team shared possible research methodologies, what was feasible, trade-offs between kind of systematic analyses and rigor, or academic rigor relative to just programmatic implementation, right? So, we talk about random assignment as being kind of the gold standard in terms of establishing causality, whereas, that was just not a possibility for Mount Tam College. They're not going to randomly assign entrants into their program. And so we had to be innovative and creative, and also honor, respect, and kind of hold up the ethos that MTC kind of espoused. The last thing as researchers that we want to do at the Possibility Lab, and really especially when we're kind of engaging in collaborative community-based research, is interfere with the program mission for the sake of research, right? And so that was immediately clear. Berkeley researchers also took MTC's standard to-date volunteer and instructor training to learn about the program, about the constraints of rules and regs, and to really kind of step into volunteer shoes. Phase 3 was kind of scoping and identifying priority concerns and research questions. So we decided to widen the scope, actually, with respect to defining research questions. We included a qualitative research component where we collaboratively designed an interview protocol with 27 formerly incarcerated alumni. Berkeley conducted semi-structured interviews, participants were paid, and then everyone had the access to the data after it was anonymized. From that qualitative data, key research questions were then formed and research scope shifted again. So we see kind of this iterative, collaborative process where everyone has input on the key priority concerns and research questions. in terms of designing and conducting the second stage of research, we decided to field a survey to current students who were currently incarcerated. We co-wrote survey questions, and this was a place where standard batteries were just not useful, right? Standard batteries often fielded to college students ask about how many errands people run in the day. Their mental health questions are not applicable. And so we had to kind of start from scratch, and luckily, we're able to pilot test with current students, had tons of great input and collaboration from, as I said, faculty, admin at MTC, currently and formerly incarcerated students. And Berkeley attended lots of MTC classes, orientations, open mics. We discussed the role of research, benefits and limitations, lots of questions from students about confidentiality, because we had a kind of very clear confidentiality process, which I could talk more about, but that had to be explained, the importance of which, right, was a chief concern for a lot of people in taking the survey. Provided an FAQ sheet, talked a lot about consent. From this, actually, Dr. Lerman and I have kind of written a best practices for conducting research inside prisons, just because there are so many things to think about, especially from a community-based perspective, and, you know, ensuring the integrity of the data, the protection of everyone who participates, et cetera. Happy to talk about that as well in the Q&A. We then held pilot survey sessions, and students made revisions and suggestions to the survey. We implemented the survey and then got to phase 5, dissemination and translation. We had a planned research presentation and discussion at San Quentin Collaborative. It has now been postponed, I believe, 3 times, just due to the various quarantines. But luckily, we have been able to go into various classes and discuss the findings of the survey. There have been peer-reviewed journal articles. I'm happy to send along the recent article that Amy and I published in Punishment and Society. And we invited MTC to join us. The collaborative declined to serve as co-authors, but they were cited, acknowledged, they reviewed all of our written work. And then, you know, we have collaboratively crafted materials for a variety of audiences, right? So, and I can talk more about how that kind of transpired. And finally, evaluation and sustaining of partnership. We debriefed about what worked in our partnership, what could be improved. We meet regularly. And the collaborative and Berkeley team just this past semester taught a research clinic at Mount Tam College. So students could actually research their own projects. And the projects were incredible, looking at everything from COs, perspectives on rehabilitation relative to punitiveness of the justice system, water quality at San Quentin, what older individuals need to know about reentry. I mean, these research projects were incredible. So again, this is the next stage in the collaboration with respect to kind of community-based research generated from the community. I'm going to do a really quick dive into some of the findings, and then we can go to the Q&A. So we settled on a lot of research questions, but the 2 main ones that I'm going to talk about today in our research, both qualitative and quantitative, with Mount Tam College was, how does prison education affect students' sense of self-efficacy or self-esteem, as well as their civic orientation, right? Their engagement with the larger community. And then why is language important for identity in the classroom? These might seem to be disconnected, but actually they're really closely connected. After kind of engaging in this phased approach and collaborative approach, we actually ended up with such a just myriad data sources. We had Mount Tam College student data, so both administrative and academic. We had our longitudinal survey data. So we did 2 waves of this survey in 2017, 2018, and 2018, 2019. And then we had just a wealth of qualitative data from the research interviews. I'm going to talk just about one slice of the data, which was our kind of within participant data, right? So a small slice of our survey population took both phase 1 and phase 2 of the survey. So we were able to really track them for a year. And, you know, we asked, how confident are you that you could do the following if you ever wanted to or needed to after your release? And we just saw pretty demonstrable increases in confidence after a year in the program, right? So compared with the year before, the same students felt significantly more confident on all indicators, right? Completing courses at a college or university, getting a job, finding a safe and stable place to live, staying out of prison or jail over a year's time. We also just saw this in our qualitative interviews, right? So it was really kind of interesting to see how the alumni qualitative interviews really paralleled what we saw in kind of change over time for students, right? So we see, you know, changes in self-efficacy. Your self-esteem definitely changes after you start to develop an identity. And that's why I started to develop not only an identity of who I was, but one that had character and strengths and just responsibility, accountability, and integrity. So the paper that I mentioned earlier really looks at this identity shift and kind of the contrasting context of having a classroom setting, a liberal arts classroom setting, inside the context of a prison, and how powerful that really is. And we saw it in both the quantitative and qualitative data. Here we see changes in civic orientation. So we see increases in program, after a year of program participation, increases in impact individuals think they can have in making prison a better place to live. The likelihood of serving in an official or unofficial leadership role in a program at the prison, and then increased frequency in working with a group or program that's advocating for political reform, social justice, or social change. And again, we see kind of the underlying mechanisms of this shift revealed in the qualitative data. You know, it's hard to sum up the effects of prison higher ed in a tiny, neat little soundbite. What would I say? I would say it's truly a transformative experience, one that will not only transform the individual, but allow the individual to regain a contributory role in society. You get out and no longer a beneficiary, but a benefactor. You give back to the community. You're involved in programs that mutually and together uplift your community, and you're no longer a drag on the community. Rather, you're dragging the community along to a better day. All right. We also saw evidence of kind of spillover learning. So within the year, students were much more likely to have actually become teachers to others, sharing knowledge with other MTC students, with others in prison, and with those they kept in touch with outside of prison. We see this again echoed in the qualitative evidence. For that time that I would tutor, I'd forget about the fact that I was a prisoner and I was a teacher. And that, you know, that identity shift away from kind of a stigmatized and problematic identity towards an empowered identity was really, really clear in a survey experiment that we ran. So the survey itself, embedded a survey experiment, had 2 different versions of 2 questions. One question randomized whether the respondent's identity was labeled as a prisoner versus a student. And then individuals were asked how confident were they that they had the skills and ability. And then in the second question, the identity label was reiterated along with the corresponding recidivism rate for that identity group. And we found some really interesting, compelling effects. So respondents who received the student label were more confident more likely to say they had the skills and abilities to accomplish their goals, also more confident in saying that they would stay out of prison if released. And those that were assigned to the student label earlier in the survey were more likely to circle student when asked, circle 3 words that describe you best, much more likely to circle student. Whereas those that were assigned to the prisoner label were 9 percentage points more likely to circle incarcerated relative to those that received the student label. So here we see language matters, right? Language matters in this creation of identity. And we saw this in the qualitative interviews, right? So while you were there for 2 or 3 hours, you completely forgot about the fact that you were in prison. You are a student. I didn't see myself as someone incarcerated. I was a student. I carried books all around and was constantly studying. 3 just super quick takeaways, because I know I am over time. I think first, this was a very high level overview of the ways in which community-based participatory research can really create meaning utilizing mixed methods and real stories and a collaborative approach that is then kind of embedded in the community. And really illustrates, finding wise that, that in contrast to the damage done by imprisonment that we know that research has shown, higher ed in prison may provide a path for mitigation, not complete mitigation, but the other, I think, big takeaway is that this will hopefully show that this is valuable to the growing cadre of higher ed programs, as well as I think it's something like 64% of people are currently incarcerated are eligible to enroll in post-secondary ed. So hopefully the Second Chance Pell program has substantial room and reason to grow. And then finally, as our results make clear, recidivism is not the only outcome of interest in studying prison programming. Higher ed can have deep and meaningful effects on identity, self-evaluation. And so I think that if we do anything, it is advocating for kind of a larger set of research questions and more vast inquiry. All right. Thank you so much. I realize that was over time, but I appreciate that. Appreciate it. Look forward to discussion.
That it is okay that it was over time. It was really great and wonderful to get a chance and get a little insight into your research. It was super fun. I'm obviously a little biased. Like 20 something years ago, I taught out in the San Quentin College program. So it's super fun to see all of that research coming together. And it's really fun to see a collaboration that's happening between Berkeley and MTC to actually gather data to use in support of prisoner education, higher education. So it's time for our Q&A portion, and I'm actually going to get us started. And it's a question for all 3 of you, actually, because all 3 of you touched on this theme of recidivism in one form or another, right? Mia's looking at how reforms like Prop 47 and Prop 57 are impacting recidivism. Amy, you were looking at how that pre-release video conference can shift reincarceration, and then Meredith, you were looking at higher ed. And so I'm wondering, since you all are in this space and you've shared this research with us, I know you're engaged in lots of other research as well. I'm wondering if you all think there is sort of one, I want to say, magic item to improve or change recidivism rates, but I'm wondering if there's something that if you've seen in your research that you think is sort of the most impactful in terms of lowering recidivism rates. And if you have seen something that you think is the most impactful thing, is it scalable? Is it something that can actually be implemented in other places?
I can start with what seems to not impact recidivism, what we might think really would impact recidivism, and how we've built sort of our sentencing structure with the idea that if we sentence people to very long sentences, if we sentence people increasingly harshly for repeated offenses, this idea that will keep us safe. And it really doesn't seem to be bearing out in many of the studies that I've been a part of. When we think about 3 strikes, I have some recent work with colleagues that really shows we don't see an improvement in outcomes because of 3 strikes, because of those very long sentences that are highly costly for the state and highly costly for the individuals. And then when we think about all the years we've been adding to sentences over time through enhancements and through using the upper end of triads and all of these approaches that have led to people being incarcerated for very long periods, we really don't see much of an improvement in outcomes because of that. So I think that is not a place to look. That's what we're learning on that side.
And I think I'll add to that. Mia is exactly right, and it reminds us that there's a big difference between individual behavior and policy response, and that when we try to understand the history of criminal justice, we're really understanding policy in addition to, or in some cases instead of, individual behavior. And so if you think about the drivers of reincarceration, often it's policies around recommitment of people for violating the conditions of surveillance. And so they get either sort of flash incarcerated or return to incarceration. And that's a set of decisions about when to send someone back. And if we think about the sort of willingness to use incarceration as this tool, right? And to Mia's point, it doesn't have the kind of returns that were hypothesized in the 70s and 80s when we built up the system. It really is a series of policy responses, alternative choices about where and how we punish people, and thinking about all of the different small policies that make a difference to our incarceration rate. And so I would say, it's I wish there was like a single thing, but it really is all of these decisions at all levels of the criminal justice system that have for so long have been focused on incarceration.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. At the agency level, there are some really kind of interesting things happening potentially at the margins, right? So, Amy just kind of provided this fascinating example that is relatively low cost. It seems like a really low lift, though, getting someone staff to kind of monitor and sit outside while individuals have their pre-release, video conference, like, is a coordination effort that sometimes seems like it takes more coordination than it needs to. But we see these kind of returns that I think are promising, and it's exciting to see agencies that we may have previous conceptions about try new things and try to innovate. Alameda Probation Department, that who we've worked with as a research partner in the past, as part of Pathway Host Home, they really are fielding some innovative strategies with respect to helping clients engage in plan making, so they can clear the hurdles that policy sometimes makes it really difficult to clear, right? In terms of appointments and needing necessary documents, et cetera, right? So kind of trying to assist clients to clear those hurdles and kind of have agency over their case planning as opposed to kind of a surveillance. There are also, numerous resources that I think that are being provided really on the reentry front and like that reentry support. And then additionally, the education, prison education, prison higher ed, I think, as a descriptive exercise, we just looked at recidivism rates for MTC graduates compared to all individuals released from CDCR, right? This is not in any way a kind of rigorous comparison, but new offenses and parole violations among MTC graduates who leave prison is about 17% compared to 65% of CDCR. That was back in 2011. So, you know, that again is a very back of the envelope comparison, but just in thinking about what the role is of these institutions as they are constructed, I think is one. But in terms of like top question, you know, top answer, silver bullet, yeah, I think I see to Amy's kind of policy. These are ramifications of policy as opposed to individual behavior.
Thank you all for that response, those responses. So my question, kind of shifting gears a little bit to something that Amy, you and Meredith talked about. You both talked about randomization in your research. Can you speak a little bit about the ethical concerns about the idea of randomizing individuals in the prison population to various programs? How do you balance any potential concerns with the potential positive outcomes of these programs, or
it's an incredibly important question, and we think a lot about it in all of the work that we do. So the reason to randomize is because it provides you sort of causal leverage on the question. And for us, we really care about what works. In a world of limited resources, we want to make sure that resources are going towards the things that really make a difference. I think one of the things that Meredith mentioned that is really critical, we worked really closely with MTC to think about whether there was a strategy where we could get causal leverage without having to randomize. And one of the things that she mentioned, which is worth reiterating, is that we would never choose the research over the project or the clients. And so we always start with this question of, is it ethical? We tend to think about, and obviously all of our work goes through an IRB. Really, the goal is to try and have an answer.
You're cutting out again.
I'm
sorry.
Here, Meredith, pick.
Absolutely. So I think Amy was saying all of our work goes through an IRB, right? So, you know, we spend a lot of time thinking about protecting all of the people with whom we collaborate on research with, and who participate in research. What I will say, I think it's actually really helpful to contrast the two projects that we presented today, because we had different approaches for each based on just feasibility and constraints and opportunities. So for ACPD, the project with, you know, the pre-release video conference, you know, there was this kind of pilot program. There wasn't enough staff to actually conduct a video conference with all of the individuals that were being released and into community supervision. And so it was like this perfect moment to randomize, because we recognized that gave us causal leverage to really, and randomize with constraints, right? Of the universe of individuals who were kind of, you know, classified as quote unquote high risk by various COMPAS assessments that met certain criteria. You know, that was a really, given that everybody couldn't receive the treatment, it made sense to kind of systematically assign it randomly. With MTC, there was just no way to assign a college education, right? It wasn't feasible, it wasn't preferable, and it also wasn't preferable from MTC to assign kind of even order of matriculation. However, MTC does have a wait list, and essentially as soon as someone applies to the program and is eligible, they go in on an ordered wait list. And so in that way, there is a a mechanism by which to kind of leverage matriculation. Because whether you get into cohort 1 versus cohort 2 is somewhat random based on your order on the wait list. And so we utilize that in our analysis as well. And so I think it's all about kind of looking at these trade-offs between really trying to see, okay, is this working, in what ways, for whom, with kind of honoring the kind of primary, do no harm, like not even just do no harm, ensure that individuals are aware, empowered, consent, and that the program is not sacrificing or being compromised in any way. Amy, it looks like you're back also, so let me know if I covered everything you wanted to say.
I don't have to say anything in addition. That was perfect.
Fantastic. Thank you.
It's always wonderful when you can just have that symbiotic brain that you're just, collectively sharing as needed.
Yeah.
The beauty of
Heather
having
and I
worked
have
together
this
for so
together,
long.
I feel
Yeah.
like, and so do Catherine and I,
Yes.
the three of us actually work that way. It's fantastic.
Great. Thank you for the answer. That was so fantastic. It was really, really fun. So thank you for walking us through that. The next question we have is actually a question that I have for you, Mia. But Amy, you and Meredith are also more than welcome to chime in if you have thoughts on this, because it's nothing like being in the middle of a research project when a global pandemic starts to really mess with your data. And so the chart that you highlighted, you showed early on in your presentation was really drawing attention to the fact that COVID also had a contribution, right, to incarceration. And so I was wondering, how impactful do you think COVID was versus reform efforts in your research? And then more importantly, was there any way to parse that in the data that you're using? Like, how did you handle that?
Yeah, that is a great question. There are some ways to handle it depending on the question you're asking. And so in some cases, with respect to looking at reforms that were co-occurring with the pandemic that affected, whether people went to prison or how long they stayed in prison, in some of those cases, we can look at their criminal history and we can precisely identify people who would have been affected by the enhancement versus those who wouldn't. So that's helpful. And at least we can see whose outcome should we be looking at during this period, and pull them out of sort of the broader group and say the ways in which the prison population has reduced because of individuals who are no longer affected by this or that enhancement, we can attribute to the enhancement, and other factors and other reductions we can attribute to other factors, probably the pandemic. And then in terms of thinking about sort of the bigger picture effect, if we're not looking at a specific reform, but we're just asking sort of bigger picture, I think it requires pulling all the way back to the local level and thinking about, well, what was happening in terms of entrances into jails? How did jail bookings change? How have jail populations changed? Because that's really the front end of the criminal legal system. And so what we really did see is a drop off in bookings into jails, a shift in the composition of jail populations. So counties were clearly prioritizing jail space for more people that are being booked for more serious offenses. And we really haven't seen the jail population come all the way back. So it's come back partially, but we are really in a post-pandemic era in terms of thinking about prioritizing jail or prison space. We're not really in that era anymore. And we're seeing that these jail populations are not coming back as much. We don't have as much flow into jails, which partially explains why we might not have as much flow into prison. And so it's not as simple as people were released early from prison in order to protect prison space and protect populations in prison, which happened more or less over time. But it's more complex than that. There seems to be a fundamental shift happening with respect to sort of our relationship between law enforcement and bringing people into the criminal legal system.
Right. Thanks for that.
Yeah, sure. Heather, did that answer your question?
It did answer my question. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So, and Meredith, you had brought up, I think, during your talk, a best practices guide for conducting research in prisons. Is that correct?
Yes, it is very high level, but Amy and I have definitely, I mean, this is kind of what I like to do. So we have a high level kind of like 2-pager or 3-pager, like things to really consider
Okay.
on when conducting research in prison. And then we also, like, I'm always happy to, hopefully my email will be included, happy to kind of discuss this for anybody who is interested. And actually, you know what? I think I can even drop the link to the guide in the chat if that is
Oh, wow,
helpful.
that'd be awesome.
Yes,
Yeah, that'd be
please do.
fantastic. Yeah, so I
Okay.
was very curious about it, and I think, I wanted to, the first question, and this is like, I hate when people say I have one question, but it's actually 6 questions. It's a lie. So this is a lie. This is a multi-part question, which is, some of the questions are not even attached to each other really. But I was curious, one, about the sort of process of generating the document, because I think I love the idea of knowing a little bit more about how this came about, and I sort of had, as you were talking and giving your talk, I sort of had an imagination of where it may have come from or how it may have developed, especially as I was thinking about Amy's talk too, and a little thinking about the intersection of your research. But then I'm curious, and all of this can go to all 3 of you, is that what role does the subjectivity and identity of the researcher play in conducting prison research, and how does this impact prison research? And I think I'm particularly interested in racial and class disparities between the prison researcher and subjects in prisons. So, as a historian, my subjects are dead. So like I have, like there is, but this is a primary consideration for me as a historian, and something that's a big part of my research as I study white supremacy in rural communities. And so but as a white person, I study white communities, but I also study people of color. So I study myself too. Like I have to understand my own subjectivity, but in working with real people, live people that are alive, feelings, right? How does that, and does that play into these best practices? I was just very curious.
Absolutely. I think, I mentioned really briefly that after this project, we partnered with MTC in doing a research clinic where students conducted their own research. And so, Berkeley can bring the methods, but at the end of the day, the kind of prime investigators for one's own community are people who are living in that community. And so even from the research questions generated, the hypotheses, the interviews, quantitative data, I think that is the goal, is to kind of collaborate and facilitate and equip individuals, specifically right now, in San Quentin, and students to conduct their own research. And then without a doubt, I think, acknowledging one's own positionality, and one of the very freeing things about interviewing is that that was mandatory in this project, right? I think there is such an explicit definition between outside and inside. Those conversations were really explicit, and they came up, the research team spent so much time inside San Quentin. A lot of effort was put into a kind of training and choosing that research team from Berkeley, who would disseminate the survey, talk to individuals about their legitimate concerns about confidentiality, right? Confidentiality as interpreted in a prison environment individuals rightfully mistrust promises of privacy, right? And so it was really critical to be transparent, explicit, so detailed, to recognize the privilege that the name Berkeley, college student, even though everyone was college student, holds, right? And to have open conversations about that, as well as open conversations about unintentional coercion, right? Because prison is a coercive institution by design. And so the perception of even kind of freely making decisions and talking about what that actually means, communicating what participation in a research project actually means, and ensuring that everyone understands that engaging doesn't affect likelihood of release, or the parole board isn't hearing anything about this. Anyway, that's kind of going into the weeds, but I think it gives a little bit of a glimpse as to how many dimensions positionality kind of comes in, and it's also ironic that we're talking about this method of like community-based participatory design when there was such an explicit definition between outside and inside. That said, because we spent so much time there in the ed building, at the end of the day, the Berkeley research team was there to answer questions, and then current students were the people who were recruiting others to take the survey. Once transparency had been established, they were able to be the trusted messengers. Yeah, so that's one example, but great question.
Great, thanks for that answer. So fun to hear about sort of that experience of coming up with best practices and conducting research inside. This question I have next is actually for all of you, and you all focus on California, and so I'm curious what your thoughts are in this current political climate. If you think there is any opportunity for major criminal justice reform at the federal level, or do you all think that it really should remain a focus at the state and local levels?
Yes, all of the above. Reform everywhere. I know my internet connection is unstable again, but yeah, I would say, the nice thing about criminal justice is there's so much opportunity for change at all levels. And I think that's where it has to happen. It really is going to take, because it is so disaggregated, you have 51 different prison systems, you have even within California, counties are making different decisions about how to prosecute or how to conduct their police departments. And so you really do have a lot of opportunity to spread best practices across all of those different levels.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think one of the helpful pieces of studying California is that California tends to do things first, and it tends to try new things, and it tends to be more progressive, and it really gives us the opportunity. And I'm not saying that's always the case, but it gives us the opportunity to use the environment we're in to inform national policy, to inform policy in other states, to have the chance to test things out. And then we have such, in addition to being kind of a first mover, we have such diversity across our local governance that you can really leverage that for what it is worth. You can leverage that for research purposes and really understand better what's working and what's not working because of that diversity. So I think that's really helpful.
Great, thanks. Reform everywhere, reform often. I feel like that's our mantra from today.
Reform early, reform often.
Yep.
Just like voting. Wait, no.
We can reform that too, Kyle.
No, this is recorded. Sorry. Oops. Please cut this section. So I have our last question for the talk, and I just have to say I was just so blown away by all three of your talks. And I think one of the things I have to say that was so impressive just about the three of you is that you all spoke about research that was just hitting very different kinds of notes, but coming together in such a powerful way, showing the possibility for reform and for doing really powerful work in criminal justice. We have so many students on our campus here at Ohlone that are interested in learning more about and advocating for criminal justice reform. What steps do you suggest they take?
Going to college is a good first step. So well done. I think, there's so many different ways to get involved. And there's, from pursuing a professional career, either in research or in practice, working with a community organization as a volunteer or as a staff person. I think the opportunity is there. There's a lot happening. And so just being educated, learning what's going on, both in your community, in the state, and in the country, and then really thinking about what kind of added value you can bring. And irrespective of what you do with your career path, there are opportunities to be part of communities of reform and change. And so always being an educated consumer of what's going on in the world, and then finding opportunity wherever you are to make a difference.
Yeah, I think there are just incredible organizations in the Bay Area and beyond that are doing just really specific work. And so, I think when we think about criminal legal reform, criminal justice system, carceral, et cetera, like it can feel so overwhelming. And so what has really helped me just in figuring out, like, where am I drawn? Like, where do I actually think there are these windows of opportunity or like critical junctures, right? And so, it could feel like a drop in the bucket, but like, it's incredibly gratifying to really get to know an aspect of this vast system that touches the lives of millions of individuals, directly, indirectly, at a community level. But thinking about, okay, where, like, is it reentry? Is it housing? Is it prison conditions? Is it prison programming? Is it prison higher ed? Is it post-release education? Like, where, what kind of draws me? Because I guarantee there are people doing that work, and if there aren't, then you should do that work. And then the other thing that I would really encourage is to look to system impacted individuals, because there are incredible organizations that are run by those individuals with lived experience that need resources, funding, volunteers, your brain power. And so that's kind of my second suggestion.
I agree with so much what Amy and Meredith said. I guess I would say, if you are looking for a push or direction, there's anybody with all kinds of interests can get involved with all kinds of talents and skills. But I do think that having the opportunity to be in college and to be able to learn how to access and use data, to be able to learn how to access and use evidence from the literature, and to be empowered to bring that information to groups that are advocating for change, that is a huge comparative advantage. And so I would just encourage, those of you that have this opportunity to be in this setting, to develop those skills and to really utilize those opportunities, because I think a lot of organizations really need that kind of support.
Thank you so much. I have to say I am super inspired, and I know that our students will take this inspiration with them as well. On behalf of my fellow co-directors, Heather and Catherine, Dr. McCarty and Dr. Michael, respectively, I want to thank our three incredible speakers today and close us out of our final event for spring 2023 here at the Lytton Center. We're really excited to have hosted such an incredible set of events this semester, and we're really looking forward for our fall series, Fall 2023. It sounds so weird saying it out loud. We're already in the planning stages and getting ready to host another series of events in the fall. Getting ready and getting excited for that. Please do follow us on our social media. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook, as well as on our YouTube channel, where you can see all of our past events. I want to thank our speakers again for spending this time with us and sharing their incredible research and insights. We hope everyone has a really spectacular day, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.